Welcome to today's episode of the Force of Nature podcast. Today's episode's guest is Silas Hedley Lawrence from Oxford. He is the farm manager at FAM Farms, and he is currently in New Zealand visiting some family and friends. Welcome to today's podcast. How are you?
Yeah, doing good, mate. It's good to have a break from wind and rain. It's pretty much rained in the UK for 8-9 months solid. I think it's teed up to probably the wettest winter ever, I think. So it's been nice to get some sun and have a bit of a break, really.
Yeah, I've seen plenty on social media of crops and farms underneath water. And you came out of like a drought before then as well, which is one of the biggest ones on record as well.
Yeah, it seems to be the trend now in the UK. It's, you could bank pretty much every season, probably, maybe get a really cold, dry spring, which we had couple of years ago, or you get like a 3-4 month drought, or we get non-stop rain. So you could pretty much put a dollar somewhere that something's going to come along to make life pretty difficult. So you just got to start planning for that stuff, really.
Yeah, I think that's a key thing to do, is try to plan as much as you can for the weather, but that can be quite hard at times. So do you want to kind of introduce yourself and your background and kind of how you've got to where you are in the UK?
Yeah, so I grew up in the UK, went to school, but spent pretty much all my school holidays out here in New Zealand. So my family have been farming around Podaki since 1800 and something or other, so dairy farms and kiwi fruit orchards. So yeah, I guess, growing up as a teenager, whilst my mates in the UK were at home playing video games in the summer, I was out milking cows and crashing motorbikes and, grazing grass and learning to be a dairy farmer in New Zealand, really. But so I guess that was kind of always my foundation in farming. Like, I'd never worked on farms in the UK until really my early 20s. And it's completely different. Like, the system's very different. Obviously, the climate's quite different. So yeah, I've lived over here in New Zealand. I've worked full time on the farm here. Learned a lot, obviously, but it's all around how do you make milk off of grass, sunshine, water, a bit of nitrogen here and there, etc. Whereas in the UK, for example, when I went back to the UK, my early 20s, after living here for a while, I got a job on a dairy farm after a year or so, and it was about 900 cows. But for the 6 months or so of winter, they were inside sheds all day, every day, and I never left a concrete yard. So it was a lot of, obviously loads of feed that was grown on the farm. Also quite a lot of imported concentrates and stuff that would be fed in the shed, and other feeds that were brought in. So, we never put a cow on grass until kind of middle end of April. But then I was away, and, I was kind of doing stuff like the New Zealand grazing style, breaking up paddocks and, growing a bit more grass, really. So yeah, it was a complete flip on what I'd always done. Obviously, growing up in the UK, I'd always kind of seen farming kind of out the window. I had mates on farms, but never really got in it and done it. So, it was a bit of an eye-opener. But I guess because of the way that I felt comfortable doing stuff, when I managed my first farm in the UK, I think I was about 23, but it was a beef farm, about 500 hectares or so. I wanted to get away from dairy basically after that kind of big 900 cow indoor system kind of thing. Took the love out of milking a bit, but the beef thing, I just did what I knew, which was quite different to the way it had been done on that farm previously. So I got everything in fewer, bigger mobs, moved them around a lot more often, paid more attention to kind of residuals and grazing covers, took a lot of the inputs out. We took a lot of the kind of concentrated feeds out of the system. I'd never really liked the idea of using chemicals, whether that's fert or herbicides or whatever. So I always kind of stayed away from those kinds of jobs on the farm out here. So kind of when I was calling the shots a bit more, it's quite easy for me to walk away from those and try and do it organically, although without certification. And just kind of played with what I thought felt right, as well as what I kind of knew how to do. And yeah, I think that farm in the couple of years that I was there, we saw quite a lot of changes. The cost of production went down a lot. Output went up as well. Input costs went down, obviously. So they had all the sheds and the barns there, but essentially I kept most things outside through the winter. So started playing with ideas that felt very normal for New Zealand, but were unusual in the UK. In the UK, you kind of got to bank that for 6 months of the year or so, you're not really going to get any grass growth. And it can be wet, as I've said, this winter it's rained pretty much every day. So if you're not hot on how you manage your grazing in the winter, it can become a bit of a mess, which is why I think the industry in general has kind of ended up with most livestock being housed indoors. In general, obviously, there's people that aren't doing that, but that's the kind of the general scope of what the system looks like in the UK.
Yeah. Did you feel any kind of pushback for you trying to take animals outside on those first farms that you managed?
I guess there was some question marks. Like, they certainly liked having lots of different mobs. You'd have like different breeding mobs of cows, and you'd have like the 1-year-old heifers and the 1-year-old steers in two different groups, and the 2-year-old heifers and steers in a separate group. So you're driving around all day just checking stock before you'd even really got around to doing anything. So, and again, they were just in pretty large areas, just kind of set stocked for weeks on end before you'd move them on. So lots of overgrazing, basically. And so, yeah, when I started doing all that quite differently, and you couldn't just go and look at your R2s, heifers or whatever. You had to go and pick them out from the steers and the 1-year-olds and everything else. So, I think it ruffled a few feathers. The outwintering stuff, probably. I think that the old guy, he wasn't a farmer that owned it, but he was stuck in his ways a bit with some of the breeding and genetics, which I wanted to push to change to kind of get animals that fitted that system a bit better. But essentially, one of the key bits of feedback I got from him when I left was I was the first farm manager in 25 years that really made a profit. So, I think he saw actually that the value in it kind of made sense, despite it being a bit of a shock at the start, really.
Yeah, and I suppose that helps with that paradigm shift for him as well, is that you're making money and the previous farm managers weren't. So that kind of backs up what you're doing on farm. Yeah, and
for me, I always try and think, and I made a lot of mistakes back then, don't get me wrong, I'd gone and done a postgraduate thing in agriculture just to kind of fill in lots of gaps so I could kind of jump up that ladder and have more of a managerial role. But those first 2 years was quite a learning curve. There's quite a lot of legislation and stuff in the UK as well, and lots of things around subsidy and environment and all that kind of stuff. So the stuff around environment and doing stuff on farm to facilitate that, as long as with all the paperwork, there's quite a lot to learn. Certainly wasn't like the perfect model system of how to do it. But I think what it did, it gave me the freedom to play with the things that I enjoyed about farming, and also experiment a bit with stuff that I thought felt right. And you got the feedback loop of, what happened when you did that. And it gave you a bit more confidence to push it. And I guess that kind of teed me up really to kind of go down a bit more of my deep dive into organics and more regenerative grazing systems. So it was a good learning curve for sure.
Cool. Can you tell us a bit more about FAI Farm and your current role there? You've been there for about 4 years now, is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. About 3 years actually. But so I guess there's a chapter just before FAI. So I moved on from that first job and set up a beef farm and set up a farm butchery as well. So the whole point of that was direct selling. So it was really finding a key unique selling point, why people wanted to pay more for our beef basically and come straight to us. And that's really where I went down the deep rabbit hole of kind of regen ag and kind of a lot of those grazing principles that were definitely different from the way that I'd done it, say, here on like more conventional pastoral rotational New Zealand systems.
Yeah.
I did that for a few years, really loved it. But, I really had this kind of light bulb moment there that, this was the thing that I found really interesting in farming and where I wanted to kind of put my time and attention and how I wanted to do stuff going forward. So, that was great. We had loads of amazing feedback of that place and people getting excited about the brand and the product and all that kind of thing. It was quite small scale. So when I found the job at FAI, so FAI is they're a supply chain research and consultancy company working with big global food brands. So, they've done a lot over the years with poultry systems, aquaculture, all over the world. There's people based in, Brazil and America and Thailand and Norway, as well as the UK. And I think they've even got someone in New Zealand, actually. So there's a lot going on, basically. But I joined them. So they're about just under 600 hectare farm right on the edge of Oxford. And they were mapping with lots of data through a formal research project what the transition of that farm looked like to get from quite conventionally managed in an organic sense to a full AMP grazing or adaptive multi-paddock grazing system. So for me, I guess there's nuances in that. I guess it's like mob grazing or holistically planned grazing, but we call it AMP grazing. Basically, we like the word adaptive, so it's not too kind of linear and this is how you do it and this is the plan. It is there's room in that you need to move and adapt in what you're seeing. But for me, that was like, right, well, if I'm really sold on this whole kind of regenerative ag and grazing systems, then for me, FAI would look like a great foundational platform to try and help transcend that system into bigger supply chains around the world. So it took a deep dive across soil health, cattle performance, livestock performance, environment, biodiversity, and even some kind of social factors of kind of how staff and the community around how they felt through the change in the system as well.
That's cool. So you kind of did it on a small scale with the butchery farm previously, and then you're trying to scale that up with FAI farms and take your learnings and then put that through research so that other farms can learn how to do it.
Yeah, exactly. So, I at the middle farm, the smaller one, is a place called English Farm. It was in Oxfordshire as well, just kind of 45 minutes out of London probably. But what I noticed there was this real buzz and excitement in and around regenerative systems. Like when you start talking about how the grazing system in place is bringing biodiversity back, it's dealing with droughts much more effectively. It's I guess less intensive in some ways, but can still give you sufficient production on like a couple hundred acres in the UK. It's pretty hard to make money in a commercial system. So lots of smaller scale, 50 acres up to a couple of hundred or whatever, a lot of those guys are direct selling. So what that did, it gave me a vehicle to interact with the public and chefs and butchers, journalists, all that kind of stuff. And I've found quite quick how excited people outside or up the industry get about this stuff. So, we're quite a lot of high ends, like Michelin star chefs that were using it. They weren't just using it, they were talking about it on their menu. And people were like going to their restaurants because they wanted to buy that product. Again, a lot of people wanted to come to the farm and we did like pop-up dinner events. It's all about how do we increase the value of the product as well. So if you've got 200 acres, right? If you make twice as much money per annum, or you've essentially doubled your acreage or doubled your stocking rate. So that's how that kind of worked out. But it became right. Well, if the general public and other people in the supply chain are this excited and passionate about what we're doing, what we were doing and talking about, then there's for me, it felt like there was definitely legs for it to go up, and that's why the going up that scale. And at FAI as well, Research Farm, we have a lot of interaction with farmers. We have a lot of groups coming to the farm, as well as like industry people, big corporations and researchers and government people as well. Because obviously we can show what we're doing and they can come to the farm and see it with their own eyes, but we've also got that data behind to kind of support that story.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think that's pretty cool. And I see that there's plenty of opportunity, even locally here, close to Christchurch, for a group of farms to kind of do that same model. We could get 5 or 6 of them together so they can supply year-round, supply all those restaurants, and also have that that involvement with the community and educating them on why they're doing what they're doing. And you could even look at the dairy beef space here, where it plugs a bit of a hole in our current farm systems in New Zealand. So I think there's a huge amount of ability to do it. It's just finding the farmers that will group together and take on this new style of grazing and regenerative processes to actually be able to sell that at a higher level. I
think there's whatever the phrase is, 1,000 ways to skin a cat. So I think if you're set up and you've got the market there and some infrastructure and the people where you could direct sell. So there's the Mangaroa farm just north of Wellington that seems to do that really well, and there's quite a few examples in New Zealand of people that are doing it. If you're like in the middle of, I don't know, East Cape or something, it's probably trickier. So in England, obviously you've got the market there. There's a lot of people, logistics are really easy. For me, there's amazing examples around the world where these kinds of systems, because it's not like you have to change or overhaul your whole system to get to a whole nother place. For me, it's like, right, well, how do we give farmers, or how as a farmer can we bring ourselves more tools in our toolbox so that we're better equipped to deal with droughts or heavy rainfall or price fluctuations and feed, fertilizer, fuel, whatever, whilst aiming to try and maintain gross product or production. So I think in New Zealand, there's lots of low-hanging fruit possibly where, we can address those kind of the operating costs or maybe even overheads just by bringing some more tools to that toolbox. So it works at scale, and it works at small scales and big scale. And whether you're just going to the commercial markets or if you want to go down direct selling or whatever, there's certainly bits and bobs that you can kind of add to your armory to make all those systems work, really.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to recognise that there is so many new tools out there. Well, they may not be new, but there's options out there to make the profitability of your farm and the long-term sustainability and the resilience with these changing climates like you're having in the UK. We'll have those here as well. We're not having them to the same scale as of yet, but it's only a matter of time. And for the farmers to just be able to actually pull some levers that don't require a whole farm system overhaul, that can make a huge difference to, I guess, their also mental fortitude going through those different periods.
Exactly. And like, no farming system makes sense if it doesn't make money. Like, if you're going to go hell for leather down regen, but you're just hemorrhaging money and your business doesn't stack up, then it's not regenerative. It's got to be regenerative across that scope of people, business, soil, environment, whatever. And for me, when people say, well, what is it? I think, right, well, depending on where you are in the world, there's all these different biomes. So, there's very few natural grasslands on the planet that if humans just weren't there, they would be a grassland. So you kind of got the prairies of America or the tundra or whatever, the Eurasian steppe kind of natural grasslands where, they've evolved to produce grasses. Whereas New Zealand is predominantly dense temperate rainforest with patches of wetland, right? In general, so it's, well, what is nature trying to do, and what's the ecology and all these ecosystem processes? How are they working, and how can we interact with them in a way that facilitates our farm production with us having to put less into it in terms of artificial inputs or more intensive management? So I'm like, right, well, if in all ecosystems, it's whether you're in the native bush or whether you're out on a pasture, everything's still working off carbon cycles, water cycles, mineral cycle, and airflow. A lot of people glance over the airflow, but it's so important. So I think, right, well, how through our management, whether that's our grazing residuals or our recovery or, whatever, planting some trees or something like that in our pastures, how can we accelerate or increase the amount of carbon going through the system? How do we increase the amount of minerals going through our soils into our plants and into our animals, our crops? And how do we slow down water, retain it, slow it down? And how do we also slow down airflow? Because when you can slow water and airflow down, you're just building that resilience to things like your drought, etc. And obviously the pressure you get from heavy winds on grass growth, livestock production, soil erosion, all that kind of stuff. So it's right. Well, you don't actually change your system, but maybe we added a bit of diversity into the pasture, get different complex of root depths, stimulate more soil microbiology, start addressing compaction in different soil scapes, because obviously ryegrass and clover, they're both very shallow rooting plants. So it's quite easy for them to kind of hit, say, a drought situation if it's a bit windy and dry. Other things, where, how can we maybe think about using trees in the farming landscape to create more shade? Because all of these native UK type pasture plants, which you get a lot of over here in New Zealand as well, they all perform best in partial shade because that's how they evolved over millennia as a silvopastoral system. So again, with that airflow, better livestock performance, less wind erosion, all that kind of stuff. So that's how it stacks up for me. And when those 4 ecosystem processes on your farm become more effective, you should be able to produce more from less. You're much more resilient to dry spells or heavy rain. Your infiltration rate should go up. You should hold more water. But also your biodiversity on farm should increase as well. And obviously biodiversity just brings resilience in with it.
Yeah, 100%. Those are all the points that I don't think get lost when you're talking to farmers or industries talking to farmers. We're seeing probably more of a intensification, which is removing a lot of those ecosystem processes like trees and whatnot that play such a beneficial role on our farming pastures, and to reduce that erosion and water cycle degradation. Like, they play such a crucial role, and just doing, like you said, little simple tricks like putting more diversity in your pastures can have such a massive outcome for the biodiversity of your farm, and then that has a flow-on effect that will build over time. So I think here, like, we need to see more of a change to, like, what you've talked about, like utilising the natural systems to get more from less, rather than trying to put more in consistently to try and grow more and get more out of it. Because we're ending up on this never-ending cycle here that is obviously going to end up in a bad way.
Yeah, I think so. And, I think I guess, I'm no expert in New Zealand ag and ecology or markets or whatever, but, you see this kind of, it's quite a heavy reliance on imported fertilizer, and, the volatility of the prices, also the future supply of that stuff is a big question mark. So kind of what happens 5, 10, 15 years from now if that resource isn't there, or if it's way more expensive than it is now. And that happens in the UK. The price of fert went up from £250 a tonne to about £1,000, so basically double that in the dollars. And that was a huge difference to really make farms go from making money to really not, to making quite a loss. So it's like, well, nitrogen's nitrogen, right? And if you're putting it there in an artificial form, a synthetic, synthetic nitrogen or fert, whatever, what impact does that have on the soil microbiology? And with the impact of the soil microbiology and everything else, is that having other effects? Like, is that proliferating? Is that decreasing the resilience of your plants or increasing things like compaction or whatever? Whereas you think about the natural nitrogen cycles, so, the atmosphere above us, the air is, it's 78% nitrogen or whatever. So in natural systems, there's no one chucking fertilizer in them, right? There's no one up in the native bush or wherever, rainforest and Amazon, chucking fert out. They're just very diverse, healthy systems that have all of the same things going on, but they're just doing it themselves because of the synergistic relationship. So if we were to address issues like soil compaction and could stimulate more soil microbiology through our management, which is underpinned by mindset as well, then maybe we can get a lot more of the free nitrogen by leaning into the nitrogen cycle. So obviously with the soil microbiology, your plant roots, obviously, they're drawing up minerals, interacting with soil biology, and they're doing this trade-off as kind of carbon economics under the ground through photosynthesis and exude these sugary carbon exudates. And different parts of your soil food web, where they're bacteria, fungi, or all the other bigger stuff that comes on and feeds on that stuff, like your protozoa and nematodes, things like that. If you can encourage as much of that as possible, then when your protozoa come along or whatever, which need air, space, and water in your soils to move and be there, and you're going to eat up that bacteria in your soil, and they're going to pop out excess nitrogen and nutrient out the other end. And that's basically how these nitrogen cycles work. And then you also got other things like rhizophagy, where plant roots are literally sucking bacteria inside the root systems, and they draw out the nitrogen and nutrient out of the little bacteria, but not enough to kill it, and they just pop out the side again back into the soil. And the bacteria is like, cool, that was cool, and they go off and get more nitrogen or whatever, and they tell all their mates that was cool, and they come back. So the plants can manage this themselves when they've got the right conditions to do it. And if you've not got if your soils are compacted, then you're not getting the air and the water as well as the carbon through photosynthesis to feed that soil microbiology, to let all that stuff happen. So, it's pretty hard to have these complex rhizosphere, like when your root zones with low diversity pastures, because every plant plays a different role. Different plants will interact with different parts of soil microbiology. They'll have different rooting depths, different root mass surfaces. Some will have good relationships with bacteria or fungi or whatever. So really complexity is what creates the health and the resilience underground. Even like rhizobia, like bacteria in the soil, because you obviously know with legumes, right, you can have all the clover in the world, but if things like your molybdenum are out, then you're not going to be fixing the nitrogen. So if your nodules aren't red inside or green, in the winter they go green, and that shows that they were fixing nitrogen dormant. If they're like white, they're not actually fixing any nitrogen. But if you had more aeration in your soils and a bit more of that kind of humus layer and building that insulation effect where you're slowing that air down. So I always think about airflow, you kind of got the big landscape level. It's like over the pastures with the trees and stuff. And then you've got the stuff above the soil, like with your residuals, like slowing it down just above the pasture, and then also aeration within your soil. So there's bacteria basically that can fixate nitrogen just out of the air without even needing the legume and make it readily available to plants in the soil. So there's a number of ways to get nitrogen into your pastures basically, and it doesn't always have to be a synthetic input. And maybe it's like, right, well, maybe through management we can decrease the amount of synthetics by 10%, 25%, whatever over time. So it's just adding those tools, not just swapping one for the other. It's right, how do we just give ourselves more options, really? For me, that's how I think about it.
Yeah, and I think that's a pretty key takeaway, is that you are getting a lot of free nitrogen from the atmosphere as long as you've got the soil function there. And probably, as you said, the biggest issue on most New Zealand farms would be air, and people think it's more water or nutrients are the limiting factors. But if you've got a huge compaction layer on your farm or a pan that you don't really know about, you're actually only operating your soil profile, your soil function at 50% or even less, which then requires more inputs and more water to continue to do what you're doing already. So, I think
sorry, they're all intrinsically linked. So,
exactly.
It's easy to think about water and minerals or, the physical structure of soil, but you rarely get one improving without the other. Like it's the whole picture. It's like thinking about things as multiple parts of one whole, and you can't separate the different parts out, which is generally what we often do in farming or have done. People think about what do we do to the soil chemistry, or what do we do to the plant or the cow? And actually, they're all reliant and dependent on each other, both up and down the chain.
Yeah. And I think, like I like to say when we work with soil, it's a three-legged stool. So you've got biology, you've got the physical characteristics of the soil, and then you've got the chemistry. So if you're focusing on one part, you're only going to have maybe short-term success. But if you want a long-term solution, increasing that soil function, you've kind of got to come at it with a three-pronged and understand that animals play an important role, so do the plants, and it's not just the soil that you're trying to fix. You want that symbiotic relationship between them all.
Yeah, exactly. I kind of think about the chemistry side. If without the structure there and the soil biology, then it's a bit like a dartboard. It's like, well, if you're restricting your soils to only be able to find and operate with the nutrients right in the middle of that red bullseye, because you've got poor soil structure, or your plants are now dependent on the artificial synthetic input and not finding it themselves through their interactions with soil microbiology, then your pool of nutrients is limited to that bullseye. But as you create soil health through your management and think about things like feeding your soil microbiology, I think it's particularly in dairy, and it is harder in dairy for sure. I'm not saying it's not. I think a lot of these systems, they're definitely easier to start implementing and getting results quickly in beef and sheep. But it's easy to think, right, what does the cow need? But actually, when you're managing pasture, it's another three-legged stool. It's the needs of the animal, the needs of the pasture, and the needs of the soil. And again, generally, I think, well, if you think about the needs of the soil and the pasture, then the needs of the cow are generally met.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's the running theme here is that all this stuff's intrinsically linked. So how do we change that lens of how we see stuff to be a bit more effective across the board?
Exactly. And I think we quite often sold like a recipe to fix just one part of the equation. And we think we might get some success for that in the short term, but then we almost get back to square one because we haven't sorted those other symbiotic relationships at the same time. And I think it's more of a mindset change. And once you start observing that everything's interconnected, it's a lot easier to understand, okay, well, actually, why am I doing this? And then you can make decisions from that point because you're actually questioning everything at a higher level.
Exactly. And I think, farmers are all the expert on their farm and they'll know their ground, their soil. And I think it's, all these ideas and stuff we're talking about, the tool you might use and how you apply it is going to change on your context. That might be your business objectives mixed with your soil, your biome, everything else. But also the tools you use and how you might apply them on your specific farm, that will probably also evolve and change over time. Yeah. As things like your soil and your farm performance, your pasture diversity, all that stuff evolves through the evolution of your management. So because it worked this year and last year, maybe actually you need to tweak it a bit now that your farm's moved on a bit.
Yeah.
So that's why for us, we love to use the term adaptive multi-paddock grazing for our beef systems is, whilst we're proactive in the planning side, we're also an element of being reactive on the ground, depending on what's going on and what we see. And, your farm evolves, nature, all Mother Nature really is trying to do, if you imagine it in New Zealand, is turn, low diversity or bare rock into kind of dense, diverse kind of rainforest. So, that's why I often see in a pasture, if you've got a dominance of a specific weed, for example, like docks or whatever, or thistles, then what is that as an indicator? What is nature trying to say is going on here in that soil? What is our management, what the conditions our management's creating? So instead of trying to fix the symptom by spraying the weed, think why the weed is there and what we can do to get rid of the weed being there. So obviously docks love compaction, or thistles love bare ground. Things like ragwort, again, like bare ground compaction. So it's, well, how do we address the compaction or the bare ground? And then as your soil microbiology evolves and I guess becomes a bit more advanced with more underground diversity, then you'll often see the diverse seed that you might have put there, or it might already be sat there in the seed bank, that will start coming through in your pastures. But maybe it wasn't there last year because the conditions weren't right for it.
Yeah, exactly. I think a lot of people don't understand that weeds are an indicator, and they're actually due to your management. It's not, they haven't blown over from your neighbours because they've got weeds. There's actually the management you've created, and they're trying to solve a problem for you. So sometimes it can be like actually let it do its job, and then the pasture will flourish after. But a lot of people are quick to just go spray because it doesn't look great, but they're actually serving a purpose in the succession of plants within the natural systems.
And that's exactly, and it is, and it's not to say that, right, well, maybe some kind of intervention isn't the right choice, but maybe just leaning into the glyphosate or whatever is not the right intervention. Maybe some kind of compost application or whatever. So really, you really want to figure out what's going on and do your soil test or whatever first. So make sure that what you're trying to address is being addressed with what you're putting in, or else you could just create another problem that you didn't think about. But there's I guess there's more tools out there than what we're used to seeing, really.
Yeah, and it's trying to figure out what works in your context and what you're trying to achieve. And I think probably the easiest thing you can do is actually just dig a hole in that area and see what's going on underneath the ground, because that'll tell you a lot more about what the management has been happening.
It's so interesting, like some of the data that we had on the farm in Oxford. We saw some levels of nutrients were really high in the soil, but they didn't actually show up in the pasture sample. So like the sample was taken next to the same hole on the same day, obviously, and vice versa. There's some stuff like selenium was really high in the pasture, but it was really low in the soil. So I think one thing to remember is us humans are quite far behind really understanding what's going on in the soil and how all these complex relationships work. And obviously also our ability to test for it. So just because our testing method in the lab showed one thing doesn't mean it's not there and working in nature. Obviously the selenium's come from somewhere, but if we'd only done the soil sample, we would have thought we were really low in selenium or iron or whatever it was that we saw these patterns with. So I think they're not always just to follow these things as gospel. It's use them with a pinch of salt and see what else is going on. Try and build as much of that picture up as you can with different insights. For me, the obvious one is actually just looking at your farm. You're out there every day. You don't need some soil lab test to tell you which paddocks are doing well and which ones aren't. If you're out there doing it and moving your cows and actually being present and observing what's going on. Again, that's why we like the term adaptive. So if it doesn't look quite right when you move your cows on, then were they too densely stocked for that cell, or maybe we should increase trampling somewhere to try and get more carbon into one corner of the field where there's obviously a bit of an imbalance or an issue. So it's thinking about what tools might I use going forward.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the benefits of the adaptive management grazing is that you've got the eyes over the land every day, looking at the pasture and is it right for the cows. Do you want to talk more about, I guess, your journey into the adaptive grazing and how it's kind of evolved over the last few years on your farm?
Yeah, I guess obviously in the UK, and it'll be similar here in New Zealand, but I guess it's just, I guess the winter's a bit harsher, or they're certainly colder, so you don't get that growth as long. But it was all about, right, well, if we're not going to house animals, how do we grow as much grass in our beef system as we can in the growing season to float them through the 6 months where there's nothing? And, the farm in Oxford, for example, it's medium heavy clay on a floodplain. So about 600 acres or so of, well, whatever that is. So 250 plus hectares of that 580 odd hectares goes underwater for a good chunk of the winter. This winter, so essentially you can bank on not being able to graze your farm or half of your farm for half the year, basically. And obviously on those kind of clay soils as well, if they tried to outwinter back in the days where it was more set stocked and the covers were much tighter and shorter, with less of that kind of thatchy layer to hold the structure above the soil, that would have been a complete disaster. So I guess it's, if you're starting to play with this stuff, it's right, well, where do we start? And for me, it's all key in the spring. So I kind of go into, what does my pasture need in the spring? That's how I think about it. And when I manage with the pasture in the spring, it tends to proliferate the soil biology. So all plants are trying to do in the springtime, when they wake up and start germinating, obviously your soil microbiology kind of falls asleep once your soil gets below about 7 degrees C. It all goes nuts, right? It all just starts growing like hell, and everyone gets excited. And in the UK, they'll open the door of the barn, of the shed, and all the cows will run out and go nuts, and they'll graze everything down to the ground. But essentially what you've done there is, you've put that plant under quite a lot of stress right at the start of the growing season, when you want to be doing the opposite. So I think, right, in the growing season, how do I put the plant under least stress? So instead of going into kind of panic mode where it just wants to grow like a little short, it goes, if it's overgrazed in the spring, it will go, right, I need to reproduce sooner. So it will grow these little short stunted plants with little short seed heads on them, and your grass growth curve for the season is probably going to be really stunted compared to what it could be. Yeah. So I do the maths, right? So, and it's quite simple. It's the same as you do anything. It's just understanding the feed and demand, but then thinking about your residual a bit more. So I lift my covers as high as I can, and I take as little as possible whilst not coming back around again too quickly in the spring. Yeah. So overgrazing it's a factor of time. It's either staying in the same place for too long, or it's coming back around again too quick. So it's finding that balance. So generally I'll aim to take about 25%. And this is for me in my part of the world, in my climate, on my soils, on this specific farm. So it's not saying this is what works everywhere. But I'll aim to take about 25% of the dry matter in the cell each day, kind of in spring. So spring in the UK is like May and June, what I'll be going back to. And hopefully by then, I'm just the amount of biomass in the pasture is snowballing. And you're also leaving behind, 50% plus of the flowers and all the other, niche biodiversity, like the herbs and all the exciting stuff that we see that play amazing roles in the pasture and interact with soil biology. So as we come into summer, you've really snowballed the amount of biomass in your pasture. And obviously pasture, not just grasses, but all pasture is a solar panel. Yeah. Obviously it photosynthesizes, it's drawing carbon out of the atmosphere, it's feeding that soil microbiology. So as my pastures get taller, I'm increasing my solar panel. I'm increasing the amount of photosynthesis, hopefully lifting my bricks levels, so making my pasture more palatable, higher nutrient, more energy, etc. But they're also being allowed to get deeper root systems, because the less stressed your plants are, and general rule of thumb, the bigger your plant above ground, the bigger and deeper your root systems will be. So you're getting more carbon exudates further down to your soil. You're interacting with more soil microbiology. You're also accessing more moisture. So in the summer, our covers could get almost like shoulder height. We've got loads of like deep rooting grasses like cocksfoot and tall fescue, things like that really, if you get in a drought situation, they're lifesavers because they just keep going. So in our drought, for example, it didn't rain in the UK from, I think it was the first week of June until the 14th of September. So we really slowed down the rotation. So in the spring, my rotation is about 30 to 34 days. I'm just skimming. And then this is all lined up with calving as well. So I'll be matching the cow's needs with her nutrition and lactation to when the grass is its best. And then in the summer, I've built this buffer so we can either cut it for hay or conserve forage for the winter, or we defer it for a drought or whatever. We just keep the rotation, but we slow it down. So in that drought, we managed to get the rotation up to 90 days. But obviously the amount of dry matter per hectare was massive because the pastures were just so tall. But obviously as you go through spring into summer, you're going from green pastures to more browny coloured. So there's more dry matter in the same amount of plant as well. So more stomach fill and everything else. So you could slow the animals down. And, what we saw, it was pretty crazy. Like I had a group of farmers on the farm at like the end of August. And bear in mind, like most of the landscape of the UK it looked like a brown, black golf course. It was completely fried. Hard, hot, bare ground. And if it had rained, a lot of it would have been like hitting concrete. We kind of moved this density of our pasture apart, got our fingers into the soil 3 months after not raining, and it was still wet in the soil. So our pastures were still growing very slowly, but they were still green and had nutrition. So things like our daily live weight gain and our fertility didn't drop in that drought period. But we had the flexibility in the planning to really slow down those rotations, and we built up that grass reserve. So, I guess, how did we come back to your question? How do I get into it? It was kind of, we need to as the farm manager on those two farms, I had to figure out how to make it work with very low or zero input, not relying on sheds. In the farm before, the Oxford farm, I didn't even have a shed, so it wasn't an option. So if you kind of ballsed it up in the spring and shot yourself in the foot, or you didn't manage it right through the drought, then you basically had no food for the winter. So I guess it was just playing with these ideas and learning as much as I could through conferences and other people and online. I've been doing about 10 years now, so I've made a lot of mistakes and learnt myself, but playing with it all and seeing what happened, and just getting every year try it and test it, try something new, and not kind of panicking if you get into that big drought or the super wet winter. Kind of treat it as a good opportunity to learn, and also obviously have a plan B and a C. So if it's a complete disaster and it's really not working, what are you going to do? But what we've seen really is, despite these mega wet winters and these big droughts or whatever, the planning and the system is stacked up, and the data and the performance of the farm and the cows hasn't really fluctuated or dipped with these tricky situations.
That's awesome. And you've done a bit of bale grazing now as well. Have you, through the winter?
Yeah, exactly. So, in the UK, as I said, for 5-6 months, I think the average housing period is about 180 days. So you can usually bank that lots of farms. And again, what you get in the UK is loads of farmers will say, well, it's all right for you down there in southern England. It doesn't work for us in Scotland or the Lake District or wherever, where it's kind of bigger, higher country. But there's farmers all over the country, including those places that are doing it and out wintering and bale grazing. So it really does, but a lot of it comes down to the planning and building your farm resilience and the production, how your pastures are working, your soil and your soil microbes to make it work. So maybe it's like easy steps at the start, or just play with it. For me, it's like, how do we just increase the amount of days grazing at the end of the season? If you can save a month from housing, you're saving money. So for us, when we started bale grazing, so bale grazing is basically we place the bales in the field, in the paddock, ready to go for the winter. And for us, it has massive cost savings, but it's done in a way that isn't trashing the place. It's not pugging or poaching or causing soil damage. It's doing the opposite. So for us on the floodplain, it was pretty easy to figure out where we had to do it. We couldn't do it where we made the hay on the floodplain, because it would all wash away down the river into Oxford and give the council a bit of a fright. So we knew the part of the farm that it would work, that's worked practically, and obviously you need the right water infrastructure, all that kind of stuff. Done all the maths the same that we would do in the growing season, feed and demand, but making sure that the utilization rate factored in wanting to leave a certain proportion behind ungrazed, because you don't want to utilize 100%, or you're going to be down in mud by lunchtime. So for us, even this mega wet winter, so we're on about the outwintering block where we're doing the bale grazing. It's all split up into like half hectare daily cells. And in each half hectare, we've got 5 bales of hay. And that was for, I think it was, in this group, it was 85 cows with calves. And we've pushed that same block up to 100 cows with calves. So, and again, we've got like another block we're doing it as well. But when we move them the day after, so we go in, we cut the hay bale, the netting. It's not wrapped baleage. It's like just hay with the single net. So the hay is actually exposed to the rain. And it does get rained on. We've even had bales outside for 2 winters. And when you unroll them the following winter, they're still green and full of goodness. as long as you put the netting side up to the sky, not the flat side up, so it doesn't get the rain doesn't get in. We'll cut that and we'll unroll the bales. Obviously, in those bales, we're bringing up carbon and fert and seed from around other parts of the farm. So you can basically use it as a tool. So if you've got parts of the farm that are lacking in fertility or diversity, then maybe you can use things like bale grazing as a tool to increase that. And we cut the bales, unroll them, move the cows in, put the back fence up so they can't go back where they came from. The maths for me, I aim to have a 75% utilization. So when they come out of the cell, even on like a super wet day, it's not been wrecked. And what we've seen in this parkland block is a lot of the data around the soil and the biodiversity has increased faster than any other part of the farm. Cool. And again, we've not put that there with stuff we've bought. It's generally been through the management, because there's three things you're managing in a grazing system that you've got complete control over, and that's grazing, animal impact, and time. So grazing is how the animal grazes the plant, the response that comes from the plant. The animal impact is the hoof prints and the trampling and everything else. And then time is how long are they there for, how long do they come back? And when you get those things right, you let nature kind of fix itself or kind of improve things. So the soil microbiology, I did a post on it online a couple of days ago, but you can really see, you wouldn't believe that those cells that the cows had come through, they're all green basically. You think you could go and graze them again. And in the UK, that would be quite unusual because of the weather and the climate.
Yeah.
But the cost saving as well, it was, I think when we had them in sheds, it was £2.43 per head per day cost.
Yeah.
So that was like all your feed, bedding, straw, labor, diesel. You're in the tractor 4 or 5 hours a day, kind of just keeping stuff ticking. And then in the spring, you then got to muck all the sheds out and spread the muck somewhere or put it in a muck heap to break down. So you're even adding even more cost than then we didn't calculate. But bale grazing, it dropped from £2.43 to £1.06 for a cow and calf, and 91 pence for a dry animal. So it was whatever 60% or more, more £1.50 saving, something like that.
Yeah, and you're getting all those ecosystem benefits as well on top of it. So you're kind of making money on top of it there, which is that's pretty awesome. Have you seen the ability to run like a higher stocking rate or in stock numbers because you're doing the adaptive grazing? Because some, I guess, guys that have gone from set stocking to it have been able to increase numbers significantly.
Yeah, I think, again, a lot of this depends on where you're starting from and kind of what you're playing with in your ground and your own infrastructure. So anyone's going to start growing more grass by having the same amount of animals, but instead of putting them in a massive paddock for a month, you just cut it into 4 and you put them in each quarter for a week. So, you're just going to start growing more grass just by little simple, easy wins. But I guess our farm's a bit odd and unique because we're a research farm. We had to kind of just jump straight in the deep end and go full blast straight away. And also that gives you insights into where the challenges might be. So, we had beef and sheep and pasture poultry, and they did a bit of a destocking at the start of the project because they needed to get the pasture kind of ahead of the animals. So that's not in every case, but often you might see a bit of a destocking. But with the destocking, your input cost and operating costs goes down. So whilst you might see a reduction in output initially, your costs go down as well. So hopefully it works out similar. But on our farm, as well as in most other examples you hear about, and there's a lot of people out there that can talk about their story all over the world, different scales, different parts of the world, etc. But it seems that after about 3 to 6 years, depending on where you are in your starting point, that the output of product, whether that's in an arable cropping system or in livestock, generally comes back to similar or the same, or in some cases more than where it was before the move into a regen system, because the soils in your pasture or your arable cropping now is much more resilient. It's much more productive off of less. So if you can get to that, and we're kind of at that point now where our stocking rate, well, it's just gone down a bit. So we've just sold a load of animals basically, but and we've had quite bad TB problems. So we've been having to cull animals a lot more than we would because of TB. But yeah, basically our stocking rate is up around about where it was before the transition, but obviously we're spending much less per head.
Yeah. Yeah. And that makes the economics stack up pretty quickly, doesn't it?
Yeah, I've seen some amazing figures from arable guys that have kind of been doing the whole no-till. They're not organic, but doing like no-tillage, regenerative kind of cropping. And some of them were in benchmarking groups with very conventional farmers, again, all quite big scale, like big guys. Mm-hmm. And the figures I saw, which again seem to follow the trend from other examples you see around the world, is their output per hectare was very similar, and in some crops was higher, but their input cost was way lower. So their margins, but again, it's not like, right, you're going to flick the switch and overnight you're going to be doing that. It's I think the main issue for this movement is farmers that want to go down that route. It's right, well, how do we mitigate the risk of getting from A to B, and how do we do it as smoothly as possible that doesn't bring too much turbulence and risk? But generally, when you get to the other side, farmers generally report it to be a really good move.
Are they integrating livestock into their systems when they're making those changes as well? Or is it just mainly just going to less tillage and then less chemicals as well?
Yeah, I think, again, it depends on the individual. Like, there's lots of guys out there doing it that haven't integrated livestock. But again, I'm talking with and quite a few of those guys, but integrating livestock is the thing they want to do next. So despite they obviously play the service in helping cycle fertility, but, instead of growing 4 or 5 different cash crops, now they might also produce beef and lamb off of nothing much more than crop residuals and some cover crops. So that, again, it's bringing more diversity to your system and making it a bit more financially resilient as well. There's a huge amount of acres out there, hectares out there that aren't producing animals. So if you could if more arable guys layered that in and it worked for them, there's some easy wins there, low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, definitely, and helps with that profitability and helps build that soil profile as well. What sort of advice would you give to someone looking to, I guess, get into the adaptive grazing? Where would be a good starting point?
I think like an easy one in this day and age is there's so much information out there in the world, and you can find it all on your phone in your paddock, things like YouTube and stuff. There's a lot of really great conferences out there in the world. There's a big one in the UK called Groundswell. And there's a number in America, and there's a lot of great farm. It's not just scientists and researchers or consultants out there talking about this stuff. Most of it is coming from farmers that are doing it and have been doing it for a long time, and other farmers that are on the start of their journey talking about what they've seen and their challenges. And I think that's the best. They're the best insights because it's real world stuff. So yeah, get on YouTube, and most of these conferences, basically, they're all recorded. So you can find all the sessions and stuff that interests you, that you think's applicable to your farm, your system, the kind of ideas that you think might work. I'm sure you could find that information online. So yeah, Groundswell is a good place to start, and just YouTube regenerative ag. There's lots of good books out there. I think the science, like the formal science and research, a lot of it's behind what's actually going on. Again, particularly academic research, it really hones in on like one specific individual part of a very complex thing. So in my opinion, a lot of it isn't really telling you very much. It's very useful. A lot of the research here in New Zealand, it seems, has really gone down the sciences around ryegrass and clover and fert, which, and this is the system that's worked so far, but is that the long-term system? So, there's there's other institutions out there in the world that have done much more on-farm trials that aren't kind of academic research. There's some cool places in the US as well as the UK, is like Rothamsted, and there's a lot of on-farm trials basically. So have a dig online. There's a lot of info.
Yeah, absolutely. And the groundswell YouTube, I've been watching a few of the YouTube presentations from that recently as well. They're all pretty clear, well recordings for anyone that wants to watch that. You do a bit online and share your messages as well. How have you found that as a farmer, I guess, branching out and sharing your knowledge and experiences? Has that been hard or?
Yeah, as you could probably tell on this pod, I talk quite a lot. So, I don't find it hard just to get on and talk to the camera, but I didn't, for me, it was quite a chore. I find it quite hard to get up and do it and actually sit down and put it all up there. But I think, I get so excited and passionate about stuff that I just see on the farm every day. I mean, it's not just, we've read it in a book and it should work on paper. I don't really get excited about it. I get excited about the things that we did and we can see what happened, or like something was really unexpected. For example, it's that wet winter or whatever. A lot of farmers that say, it can't work on our farm. It's not saying, well, you're wrong. It's like saying, well, we tried it like this, and here, look, this is how it worked for us, and here's some of the insights. I think generally that's what I find valuable. I think lots of other farmers connect with, is other farmers sharing their experience. And there's a lot you can learn from everybody. And I get really interested talking and listening to guys that are doing stuff that's completely different from the way that I do it. But yeah, I guess it's a work in progress, all that social media. And I know you've been busy on it with obviously the pod and getting on YouTube and everything else. So I'm sure you got.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. It's a bit of a chore though, isn't it? Like, it's not a natural thing for me either, but I feel like I'm just sharing what I'm learning as well, and someone will take that away, or it's just opening their mind to think about something differently. And I think it's almost like what you're doing is kind of like an online discussion group where farmers used to go to farms, and well, they still do, and see what people are trying and how it works and what doesn't. But it's always that classic crash cry of, that won't work on my farm for X, Y, and Z. But it's like, well, if you can make it fit around your context and take what works, we'll give it a try. That's a great start.
Definitely. And, if you do a bit of digging and ask, and if you get in the right spaces, there's loads of, farm communities and WhatsApp groups or Facebook groups, whatever, you'll probably find someone who's got a very similar farming system to you that's tried stuff or done stuff that you think might not work. And again, I think it's just starting with your own easy wins, low-hanging fruit. And I think why farmers get so hooked on these kinds of systems is when you start doing it, and you don't just dip your toe in and then back out because, the farm got a bit messy and the grass got longer. You've got to, give it a good go. But generally farmers see such fast, rapid changes and improvements in a positive way. Most stuff in farming, you do something every year for 20 years and you might see a tiny % increase in something or other if you're lucky. But in lots of these systems, because they're so different, you can see big changes quick, and it can get really addictive. And then you get more kind of courage to go and push it harder and try a bit more and experiment. I think an easy one for me is, if you want to just see, is like cut a paddock in half, and maybe play with a different residual length in your pastures on one half over the other, and then just literally see, and in the same field, in the same time, same season, and then you can see the differences.
Exactly, and that's a simple, very easy to see with your own eye. Get your eye and see what's working and what doesn't. You can try to figure out why, or if that will fit on a wider scale, which is pretty cool. So if anyone listening to this wants to connect with you, what's the best way to find you or see what you do?
Yeah, I guess the easy one's the Instagram account, which is at grass-fed farmer, and then there's a little underscore in between grass-fed and farmer. again, like email, just drop me a message on that. I'm actually in the process of setting up a website, so I have a more kind of formal space and email address to get in contact. But I think the big thing for me and kind of my next step is, I'm actually leaving my current role at the end of June.
Okay. Yeah.
And I'm gonna figure out, kind of put myself in a space where a bit of a kind of coaching consultant thing for regenerative grazing systems and general moves and transitions towards those kinds of practices. So whether you're down the road already or if it's just ideas and stuff, hopefully I can help people that want to look at that kind of stuff. And for me, it's I'd love to figure out how to make that work both in the UK and over here in New Zealand, and kind of collaborate and contribute to the things that are already going on here at people that are kind of doing interesting things, and see how my skills and experience might be able to kind of contribute in that way, which would be cool.
That's awesome, yes. And because you've actually done some farming here as well, you can actually speak to your experiences and understand a bit of the landscape as well. So it's not like you're flying blind, which is pretty cool. It's a pretty big step as well, going away from the farming into the consulting or coaching world. Yeah,
I'm pretty nervous about it for sure, but excited as well. And I'm sure that I'll probably try and keep skin in the game and somehow maybe kind of find some kind of role on a farm. But for now, I think it's just create some breathing space and see what people are interested in and where the opportunities are. But for me, it's when you look at the speed, it's not so much here, but when you see, 5 years ago in the UK, you'd read like the farming press, like Farmers Weekly or Farmers Guardian or whatever, and maybe once every 3 or 4 months you saw a little bit in the back of the magazine about something to do with regen. Whereas now it's like 3/4 of the thing, and it's not that everyone's doing it. It's certainly not the mainstream, but there's people are certainly seeing value in it, and it's drumming up lots of interest for different reasons. So I think if if you can put yourself in a position where you might be able to help other people along that journey, that's kind of where I'm trying to get to. So
and I think, like you said, that's definitely growing. New Zealand's probably a little bit behind on the regen in terms of the amount of people and the farming papers talking about it, but there's definitely more interest around how can they make their systems more resilient and more profitable, because all our prices of everything's gone through the roof in the last year and the payouts have all dropped. So it's giving those people that, I guess, that kickstart of like, oh, how can I actually make my system better? And with that, a lot of people will start dipping their toes in regen. So I think, that's kind of why I'm out of my own as well, is because I see that people need that support and coaching, and I've got the network of that. If I don't know, I can share that with them as well.
Yeah, there's so much expertise out there in different places, and you'll know way more about it than me. But I guess the farming landscape and environment in New Zealand is worlds apart to the UK, and there's a lot of kind of public and private money in the UK incentivizing farming with and for the environment, which obviously you don't get here. So I guess there's more kind of levers and incentives that are just intrinsically linked to the business side and the market over here. So I think it's definitely a different kind of melting pot of stuff that's moving. So I think there's certain things that New Zealand might pick up or learn from the US or Canada or the UK, but they've definitely got quite a unique set of circumstances here, and even things down to the ecology and the natural biome and kind of what we're trying to do on farmland in relation to what might work. Down where you're on Canterbury, right, the soils are going to be quite different to up here in the North Island. So, and they'll be wildly different from what might work in the UK or the US. So I think it's look at what's going on with interest, and I think all the smart cookies over here that start playing with this stuff, and as you say, start reducing the amount of inputs slightly, or just bring a bit more resilience to things like drought, then hopefully they'll get a good bit of, kind of feedback from that in the media, and people will start learning from them.
Exactly. And I think everyone's when they get on these journeys, they're always open, like book kind of like, this is what I'm learning, this is what worked for me, what didn't, and always happy to share with others. So I think that's the great thing about the farming community, particularly the guys that have gone regen. They're always happy to share their story. I normally finish the last part of these podcasts with a couple of quick-fire questions that I run past everyone. So the first one is, what's your favourite thing to cook? Because we're talking about farming and producing food.
I love cooking over fire. So, not just the barbie, but, digging a pit and lighting a fire and getting big chunks of meat, like, those big whole picanhas or Côte de Boeuf, things like that, and loads of veg. And that's quite fun to play with. We get a lot of people around and, kind of big bits of meat is quite fun.
Yeah, and make a bit of an event out of it, a bit of a social gathering. If you could have dinner with any person in the world, dead or alive, who would it be and why?
Oh, man, what a question. I don't know. I don't know. Like, that guy from Wolf of Wall Street would be pretty wild. That'd be a pretty fun night out. But I don't know. There's so many interesting people. I think it'd be so interesting to sit down with, like your earliest ancestor in New Zealand, like when the first Hedley or whatever got off the boat in 18 whatever. Like, what did it look like in the Podaki, and what were they doing? It looked so different from now. I think that would be a cool one.
Yeah, and like, what was their plan when they got off that boat? Like, what were they thinking they were going to do, essentially? Because they would
have known nothing about what they were walking into, right? Pretty cool.
Yeah, she would have been pretty big change. The last question I had was, looking back at your younger self, what is one piece of advice you'd have?
I think it would have been be more consistent and proactive. So I've always gone through like phases of like, I'll get really nerdy and do like online training or read stuff. And I think the more, like, I get really into stuff and excited and passionate when I feel like I'm kind of progressing. So I've definitely gone through phases where I've not done that for a while, and probably gone out on the beers too much with mates, and but yeah, I think that would have been the bit of advice, is keep doing what you're doing, but go harder and faster, and just enjoy it, and kind of have the courage to play with stuff and experiment and keep learning, really.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And if finally, what's one thing you would change about the agricultural industry if you could?
I think I'd try and, if I could change the perception of the industry, both, in the public space, also within the industry as well, a little bit. So, I think farmers, in whatever they're doing, however they're doing it, they're doing such an important role in the world. And I think a lot of the bad press that farming gets is generally because farming's been pushed to a point of farming in a certain way because of the pressure and the market forces and the demand that consumers want cheap food or whatever. And it's pretty hard to do all the amazing things that farmers can do, whilst basically trying to produce a product that it's in some cases it's impossible to produce it for that cheap. And farmers, I think, farming is the only industry, in my opinion, that can fix a lot of the problems that we're seeing in the planet. The majority of the land that humans are on is producing food and is managed in some way. And if we think about how farming might be able to address some carbon emissions and sequester more carbon and hold on to more water, the impact that could have on the planet and biodiversity, and just reduce the amount of flooding and all the kind of damage that can be done. I think the public perception of the average farmer and what we are doing could be much more positive, and I think that would you know, it'd really kind of inject some energy into the industry and probably bring in a bit more ideas and talent from other industries as well. So yeah, I think the perception would be the main one.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, thank you very much for your time today. I know you're visiting family in New Zealand, so thanks for taking some time out from your holiday. Really appreciate it.